the weekend, the U.S. conducted a surprise operation in capturing Venezuelan leader Nicolás Maduro and his wife. Since then, President Trump said several times that the U.S. would control the country. But Secretary of State Marco Rubio said something different, and it raises a lot of questions on who would actually control the country. Our legal expert joins us now to break down what the law actually allows and what it doesn't. Whitney, thanks for coming in.
Sure thing.
First, let's talk about Maduro's extraction. Did that violate international law?
Yeah. Well, I'm not a specific expert on international law, but I did a fair amount of research, and the experts, I think there is a consensus there that it did violate international law, and specifically the UN, the United Nations Charter, section Article 2, subsection 4 of that, which essentially says, look, you can't go into another sovereign country and use force unless there's a self-defense rationale, authorization of the UN Security Council, or with that country's consent. And none of those things appear to be the case. That was just not the case. And I know the president and Marco Rubio, they've said different things, saying that it was a law enforcement and things like that. And so they may have an argument that, hey, this was self-defense in threats of narco-terrorism.
Right.
But it's still a hard case to make. And for them to say that it's not a use of force, but law enforcement, that facts don't support that, because there were 15,000 troops in the region. They used aircraft carriers. This was intervention that was authorized by the highest authority, the president. They targeted an acting head of state. So all those facts together really suggest it wasn't a law enforcement operation.
Does he have immunity as a head of state?
Well, I think he probably does. International law says heads of state have immunity in foreign courts, and our Supreme Court actually recognized that in an 1812 case. Now, the real question is going to be, is he the de facto leader, or is he just an acting head of state? And there's conflicting evidence there, because when he came into office, when Hugo Chavez died, and he was elected in a narrow election in 2013, and the U.S. had recognized him as a legitimate head of state. But since 2019, both the Trump and Biden administration did not recognize him as a head of state.
Yeah.
So that's going to be a legal argument.
Right. What about his wife?
Well, his wife, that's really interesting, because she wasn't part of the initial indictment, the 2020 indictment. She wasn't listed. But the new superseding indictment that was just unsealed on Saturday listed her as well on these drug and terrorism charges. So she's going to be, facing these U.S. federal courts.
Do you think that the U.S. courts will care at all about the circumstances surrounding the capture of them?
That's a great question, and probably not. There's a number of cases. There were several cases in 1886, 1952, and 1992 that rejected claims by criminal defendants who said, hey, I was brought here improperly. And really, I think the principle behind it is it's the defendant's presence that matters, not necessarily how they got there, which feels a little counterintuitive to our laws, because we have these procedural and substantive protections, but that's really how our courts have ruled.
So we've heard President Trump say several times that the U.S. is going to run Venezuela.
Yes.
Marco Rubio has said some different things. Is that even legal?
I don't think so.
Okay.
And, the real question is, what is the basis upon which you're going to run it? What I heard was they're going to have these oil companies come in and put billions into the infrastructure, which speaks to the oil piece, which I think is probably part of the motivation behind this move. But it doesn't say anything about the governance. And of course, they do have a vice president who he said, well, if she goes along with what we want to happen, then she'll stay in office. But how you actually can manipulate and maneuver another sovereign state's elected officials and heads of state, I don't see that. And from what my research, there really is no legal basis, and a lot of legal scholars, I think, are in agreement on that piece. And so really, it looks like an illegal occupation under international law. So we'll have to see what happens. And the real downside of this is that now this chips away at the U.S. legitimacy when it then says, hey, this was an improper, Russia going into Ukraine, or if China invades Taiwan, and then the U.S. tries to kind of take this moral stance, it chips away at that legitimacy because we did the exact same thing.
Right. It's a slippery slope.
Yes.
Uncharted waters here, too. A lot of unanswered questions. We'll see what happens with that part of it. We know Maduro will be back in court in March as well. So a lot to come, a lot to go over. Whitney, as always, thank you so much for coming in.
Sure thing. I'll see you in March.